Chapter 2, Section 5, Congress, Procedures and Processes, Part 2. Budget Process. One of the primary objectives of the legislative branch is to pass an operating budget for the federal government. The expenses in the federal budget can be divided into three primary categories: mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and interest payments on debt. Mandatory spending refers to the government's pre-existing financial obligations under entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare. The cost of these programs cannot be reduced without amending their original authorizations, a step that is typically seen as politically unpopular. In 2016, mandatory spending accounted for approximately 64% of the federal budget. Discretionary spending refers to any other expenditures of the federal government, except for debt payments. As its name implies, discretionary spending is optional. The amount of discretionary spending is determined by the annual budget process. In 2016, discretionary spending accounted for approximately 24% of the federal budget. When setting the budget, Congress initially establishes an overall level of discretionary spending. Then, each House refers the matter to its Appropriations Committee, which determines how to allocate discretionary spending among the various federal agencies and programs. As with other legislation, the final budget must be approved by each House of Congress and signed by the President before it can take effect. Because mandatory spending comprises such a large portion of the federal budget, it significantly impacts the ability of Congress to pass a balanced budget. That is, a budget in which the government's revenues are equal to its expenditures. As entitlement programs increase in cost, Congress effectively has three options to address the potential imbalance between federal revenues and expenditures: reduce discretionary spending, increase tax revenues, or permit a budget deficit. While both Democrat and Republicans often cite balancing the federal budget as a fiscal goal, in practice, it has proven difficult to do so in the modern political era. Budget surpluses, when government revenues exceed expenditures, have occurred, but they have been rare. Instead, the federal budget usually runs at a deficit, and unless discretionary expenses are reduced or taxes are increased, this trend is likely to continue. Questionable procedures. Earmarking is the practice of allocating funding to a specific government program and has frequently come under fire. It is often criticized as unnecessary spending, especially when it benefits a small number of people, usually voters in the home district of the legislator who propose the earmark, at the expense of all taxpayers. This type of earmark is referred to as pork barrel spending, or pork, and historically it was difficult to avoid because the back-and-forth bargaining that occurs between legislators who agree to trade votes on each other's legislation, or amendment, commonly known as log rolling. However, within the past decade, several high-publicized examples of pork barrel spending were viewed as evidence of government waste. As a result, earmarking became politically unfavorable, and Congress banned the practice in 2011.